panel. My name is Paul Francisco. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at State Street, but I'm sitting here representing my full-time and most important job, which is as a father of two BPS students. And I'm joined by a very esteemed panel of community partners and critical partners to BPS. So welcome to those of you in the room and those of you who are watching the live stream on Boston Community TV. As a reminder, we are seeking your input after each of these interviews, and you can send an email to superintendentsearch@bostonpublicschools.org email and give us some feedback on the panel and what you've seen or heard to see or hear today, the first of 4 opportunities to get to know Dr. Brenda Cassellius. So welcome back to Boston. We ordered the rain to stop just for you and for this proceeding. So with that said, we'll start by reintroducing the panelists that were here yesterday and to welcome 2 new panelists that are joining us today. So starting from my left, we have Anthony Benoit, who is the president of Ben Franklin Institute of Technology. Next to him, we have Kristen McSwain, who is from Boston Opportunity Agenda, but also happens to be the proud mother of 3 BPS students, as well as a spouse. We have to my right, Dr. Vanessa Calderon, who is the executive director and chief executive, I should say, for Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción, IBA, in the South End. And we also have Sean Brown, the executive director for Becoming a Man, a critical partner for BPS. But also another interesting fact about Sean, he's actually a product of BPS and a proud alum of the system. And it's great to see you here. And it's great to see the work that you're doing with Becoming a Man. So having said that, I will do a quick bio introduction to Dr. Cassellius. And then we'll proceed with a 2-minute introductory statement, opening statement, as we did yesterday, and we'll proceed with some questions from the panel. The great thing that happened yesterday was that we were able to get some audience questions. So Liz Sullivan will be around the room with some notes that you can handwrite your questions if you feel comfortable enough to share your name or the organization you represent. That's great. If not, that's not a problem. But yesterday we did get a couple of really good questions from the audience into the process, which was welcome. And with that, I will proceed to introduce Dr. Brenda Cassellius, who has spent 3 decades as an educator devoted to helping all children succeed and thrive. Most recently, as Minnesota's Commissioner of Education, she worked to enact comprehensive education reforms that benefited every child throughout the state. Her straightforward, community-driven approach resulted in a remarkable list of accomplishments, including historic new funding for schools, the enactment of all-day kindergarten, state-funded preschool for 25,000 3- and 4-year-old children, and the highest high school graduation rates on record. So with that said, Dr. Cassellius, welcome your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Francisco. I am just so thrilled to be here today, and I've been looking forward to the opportunity to speak to the community and learn more about Boston Public Schools as well as Boston City and the hopes and dreams of all of the community members. So today is a great day for me, and I'm really excited. I'm Brenda Cassellius, and I have worked my entire career to challenge ourselves to do better for kids and to find those practices and support systems that are going to make a difference for all children and families. And so over the past 8 years, I've been the Commissioner of Education for the state of Minnesota. It's been my proud honor. I've been humbled to be able to do that with Governor Mark Dayton. We did have a lot of remarkable accomplishments. Today, I woke up to a text from the new commissioner stating that we're at the highest graduation rates in Minnesota, which I'm super excited about. So it's a really great day for kids in Minnesota. Then before that, I started, why don't I go back and was a paraprofessional first, special education paraprofessional. Always have worked with children that have been our most vulnerable, and then was a teacher and a school leader, and worked in Memphis, Tennessee, and turned around middle schools there. And then Minneapolis Public Schools as associate superintendent, again, then superintendent of East Metro Integration District. And so I've had quite a career, and I'm looking for the great opportunity to give back to a community that's ready to go even further for kids, make even greater progress on closing achievement gaps and raising the bar, and really leveraging all sectors. I think one of the things that I've learned as I've moved out of being commissioner over the past 8 years is that it really does take an all hands on deck approach. And I am looking forward to working in a community that is looking toward leveraging every single resource for children, especially children who have been living in conditions of poverty, and children who are not yet speaking English, and immigrant and migrant children, or children who are coming over age new to country, who would need additional support in adult education programs. So that takes all sectors, and so when I met with the search committee, I talked about really looking at all sectors and really leveraging that, and I think mayoral control of the schools allows for that with the school committee, to be able to look at all of the different partners. Unique to Boston is that there's a lot of smart people here who are already doing a lot of great things, and I think just coordinating those efforts and bringing a little bit more coherence to a vision really could set the stage for some really remarkable results for children and for families. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we'll start with, to my right, if you don't mind, Vanessa, with the first question. We'll go to Sean, we'll come back to Kristen, and then we'll end up with Tony, and then we'll hopefully generate some questions from the audience as well. So
Wonderful.
Vanessa.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome to Boston, Dr. Cassellius.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Good to meet you as well.
As you know, Boston is a world-class city, but it also is a very parochial. Boston also has a long-standing reputation of a place that is very hard to crack into it, right? To make a dent and to create community. It's possible, but it has that reputation. So as a newcomer to Boston, can you give us your ideas on your 100-day plan on how you will engage, communicate, and connect with parents and with communities across the city, community organizations, and other stakeholders like business leaders?
Thank you very much for that question. It's a really important one, and it will determine the success or failure of the next superintendent, really, is being able to engage broadly in stakeholder and really bring a whole wide perspective to the work and moving the work. I think that that's what makes leader-proof teams, is really embedding a vision and a shared purpose among all the stakeholders, so it comes to be the work of everybody and not just the superintendent or the superintendent's team, but everybody believes in the work moving forward. And so within the first 100 days, there's the personal aspect of me personally being an outsider and coming in. I believe that I've been able to demonstrate my ability to adapt to new communities, having gone to Memphis and working in Minneapolis and St. Paul and other communities, and then as a statewide leader and going across all of Minnesota and learning about our rural communities and our suburban communities and our ex-urban communities, and really listening to real Minnesotans about what their hopes and dreams are. And so for the past 8 years, I've been able to get into hundreds of schools and hundreds of communities and had hundreds of town halls and learning about what they like to see. And I've also done that as a practitioner. So I would take that same approach, but I would also need folks like you to adopt me and to help introduce me to the community and to help me understand the context. I wouldn't want to assume that because something worked in Minnesota or Memphis or in any other setting I've been in that it's going to actually work here. I'd like to know from the community what it is has worked and not worked, And so one of the first things I would do within my first 100 days would be to meet with teachers who are 25 years plus, and then I'd meet with teachers who are 20 to 25 years, and teachers who are 15 to 20 years, and then teachers just on down in 5-year increments to see what have they been asked to do, and put that all on a list and try to organize what they've already tried, and what they haven't. I would do a similar thing with the community and ask them, what is it that you've tried? What is it you're currently working on that has worked? What is it that you think we still could strengthen and move forward with? And I would meet with higher ed partners, nonprofit partners, philanthropic partners. I'd meet with city officials. I'd meet with state officials. I'd try to ask for a meeting with the governor and the legislative leaders, because all of that is going to matter when you go cross-sector and when you are doing an all hands on deck. And so I would hope that people would grant me those first and second and maybe third meetings over that first 100 days. And then it's going to be summer vacation, so I'm not sure I can get into all of the schools to be able to see all of the schools. But once I hit the ground running, if I were your superintendent, when school starts, I would, within the first 100 days of school starting, get into every single school and really talk to the youth there, talk to the teachers and the paraprofessionals and the custodians and the cafeteria workers, because we all have a role to play.
Great, thank you. And I know that Boston does get a reputation for being cold and anti-personal. I personally been an immigrant to the city and being here over 30 years. I've found that the city has evolved, and I'm sure that whoever gets to be the next superintendent will be given a very warm welcome. So,
Can I say one thing, Mr. Francisco? Can I add to one more thing?
Sure.
When I went to Memphis, this is a really fun story. When I went to Memphis, there was a principal that I met with who had been in Memphis for a long time. And I kind of have a nice, kind spirit. And so I was meeting with them, and we were meeting privately. It was one of my first meetings, and he sat me down. He said, you know, Brenda, that warm and fuzzy stuff isn't going to work down here in Memphis. You got to, be a little bit tougher. Then it was about a year or two later, and we were getting some great results, and he's like, okay, I guess the warm and fuzzy stuff does work. So it was, he had a complete turnaround. He actually replaced me as middle school superintendent down there in Memphis. And so I think that, sure, people have reputations, but when you're working for children, everybody comes around, and I think I'm not worried at all about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sean, next question.
Good. Thank you, Paul. Excuse me. Good morning and welcome, Dr. Cassellius. A pleasure. And again, congratulations on the great news out of Minnesota.
Thank you.
The district has acknowledged the school-to-prison pipeline and has been intentional around its efforts to address and dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline, both internally and working with community partners. I like to preface my question around 3 data points, highlight 3 data points. The district reports 32% of black scholars, and when I say scholars, I mean males, and 37 Latino scholars were chronically absent from BPS at the time of the study. 10% of black scholars and 6% of Latino scholars are suspended annually from the district. And in Boston, suspension rates for young men of color are 3 times that of, white males. 60. So why is that important? Why is that important? I'll say here for 2 reasons. Research has shown that for students who are suspended and disengaged, that they're either left back and eventually drop out, and which eventually leads them to the juvenile justice system. 68% of youth convicted by the juvenile justice system are black and Latino, despite making up only 10% of the state's population. So my question is, what's your commitment around the school-to-prison pipeline? And how do you plan to build on the work that has already been started in the district, and what role does the community play in that? Community partners.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your work in working on suspensions. There's several things that I've done in my career around suspensions. One is as an assistant principal at a high school. really working with student and youth engagement to ensure that students are not suspended, and working with teachers around practices, first office referrals and other restorative justice practices. So I did that as a practitioner. But then in Memphis City Schools, we actually ended corporal punishment, and we had a blue ribbon plan, which Dr. Johnson had put me in charge of for the 122,000 student district. And so we were able to incorporate practices, positive behavior intervention systems, restorative practice systems, and really shift a culture at the school. So there's the prevention side, then there's the intervention side. And then there's the instructional side of having students engaged with high expectations, being very important, and the cultural competence of our teachers and being able to understand, that if a student is talkative in class, that's not something to suspend them for. So we were very clear on what were suspendable behaviors and what were not suspendable behaviors. In Memphis, we also worked with the county attorney's office because we found that students who were in a fight, for instance, would get an arrest record. And so we worked with them to change that practice, and that was really important. And so we saw, with the addition of PBIS, we saw decreases in the suspension rates in Memphis. Then in Minneapolis schools, we worked on suspensions at schools district-wide, and we especially worked on withdrawals and following up on students who were disengaging in school, which was critical to be able to follow up on students and make sure that they don't fall through the cracks, especially our students who were not credit ready. So that was really important, and we saw increases in their graduation rates and their engagement. And then we had summer youth programs. They were not started by me, but they were started by the mayor at the time, step-up programs during the summer times, because we know in summertime youth can find themselves and you're not as busy, and finding themselves not making the right choices, and so making sure that you fill those summer gaps. And then just recently, as commissioner, we partnered at the Minnesota Department of Education with our human rights commissioner to be able to look at the schools that were disproportionately suspending students. And we worked with those on diversionary plans within the school districts, worked alongside them so that they didn't have to have an investigation and a finding in terms of a violation of human rights. And so at the highest level of human rights, we've been working in Minnesota with our districts who had the highest proportion of suspensions to really deal with that. As far as the community goes, we've partnered with our Minnesota Education Equity Partnership, who has been doing a lot of work around suspension knowledge and work. We've also changed policy and law and student rights and responsibilities. I think it's really, I was looking at this when I was trying to do some research on Boston, and I was really impressed with the student youth group, the BSAC group, and the app that they designed on their rights and responsibilities. I'm very impressed with that app to share with students, and they created a little video to show students how to use that app. So that's very progressive and useful. I actually text that to the Human Rights Commissioner to share that with some of our Minnesota districts. So that's my experience, and that's what I would do. It's incredibly important. Kids have to be in school. They cannot be pushed out, locked out, kicked out of school. And I'd work on both the academic side, partner with community, and also with our civic leaders and our governmental leaders to address disproportionality.
If I may.
Can I say one other thing?
Go ahead.
One other key piece of addressing this is the prevention side and disproportionality in special education as well. Too many of our Black youth and Latino youth are over-identified in special education, and as a department, we have looked at that, and we are working on that. We have a very talented individual at the department who is working with school districts on disproportionality and the over-identification of African American kids and Latino males mostly in emotional behavior disturbed categories.
Just to add to that question, because it came up yesterday, which I think is important, can you tell us about specifically what you've done around the extended sort of support system for that student? meaning family, relative members, other support systems. So what are some of the interventions or some of the things that you've sort of enacted that help take care of the individual as a whole versus just what the school can do for that individual while they're in school?
So it's a really good question, and family services are incredibly important, and crisis services. So in Minnesota, we've partnered with our Department of Human Services to have community-based mental health grants that go out to our school partners, and then schools actually partner with our community base. We've also worked with our intermediate school districts in order to look at services for youth and families and provide the additional professional development that teachers need. We've added additional counselors to schools to provide support, and social workers so that social workers can provide crisis services. We've also done incredibly creative programs around housing and mobility. All of those things matter because when families are in crisis, you have to be able to give them the support and services to help them succeed so that children are stable and can have the support that they need. So those are some of the things I've done recently.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you.
Kristen,
Or
I'll
I've
turn it
been
over
part,
to you.
I've not done them all myself, obviously. I've been part of creating conditions for others to have access to the
Absolutely.
funds or the resources to partner with us on those things.
Great, thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Cassellius, and welcome.
Thank you.
I want to follow up actually on those questions and actually a couple of things that you've said already this morning around cross-sector coherence and partnership and all hands on deck. As you mentioned, Boston has a really rich and complex landscape of assets. We have lots of higher education institutions, a ton of nonprofits and
Right.
cultural institutions, philanthropy, you name it. We have all of these rich assets. And yet, over time, we've fallen down in activating all of those assets to ensure that all of our students have both access to those experiences in an equitable way. We have some schools that have lots of really robust partnerships and others that, while they're not quite partnerships deserts, they're close to that. And we haven't, I think, been able to activate them to assist in closing opportunity gaps.
Yeah.
And so my question for you is, what in your experience you would bring around operationalizing partnerships to really help us systemically get at providing opportunities for all of our young people to have the kind of rich 21st century education that they all deserve?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's one of the most critical pieces to really moving an agenda. So you need a bold vision where everybody has a shared purpose and has say in that vision and can see their part of that. And then I think you need a coordinator of volunteers, a coordinator of partnerships who keeps their pulse on it and then looking at and gauging where are those partnerships happening with school districts and with schools, and making sure that schools all have equal access to those. For instance, let's say fundraising. Some schools, for instance, can raise, $35,000, and how do you, and then others in 3 days, and other schools can't raise anything. So how do you create those equitable resource distributions and allocations among those schools? And sometimes it means that you might put in place equitable distribution of that where they are able to raise part of it, but then some of that goes to a larger pot where it gets distributed to everybody, or you create a angel fund where then those funds are used in the other schools that aren't able to create those kinds of resources. And so somebody's keeping their pulse on all of that, and as superintendent, I would make sure that all students have equitable resources going out to the schools. Some of that's human capital as well, and having personnel at the school and volunteers at the school. We've been able to have a wonderful program in Minnesota called Reading Corps, where kids have tutors. And when they were asking for more money at the legislature, I met with the leaders of the Reading Corps and said, we need you in our tribal schools. We need you out into working with American Indian youth because that's where the need is. Or we need you in this high poverty school, and can you prioritize at the preschool level rather than because your results aren't showing as great at the higher grade levels. So they worked with you. So it's kind of knowing where those grants are, looking at the data where the need is, and then plugging those holes so that you can actually move the agenda for the kids. And then you match mission and vision with your community organizations as well. So if you have the BAM work, you know, where is that going to be the best lever for change, and where will they feel as though they have the right resource, the right match, and then actually get that moving and get those folks into that area. And so that's what I would do.
Great, thank you. Turn over to Anthony.
Good morning, Dr. Cassellius. Thanks for being here this morning to
Thank
talk
you.
with us. I'm going to continue that theme, actually, the next
Great.
question. We've been talking about the continuing opportunity gaps across race, academic background, neighborhood, language, alternate abilities, even student interests and predisposition seems to make a difference. And you've talked about some of what you would do, but I'd like to hear more comprehensively your role as superintendent in closing those gaps.
So it's a good question. I think that I think my philosophy is that closing gaps is both academic in-school factors, and I think that's I have more control over, but then there's the out-of-school factors that we need to leverage your help with, and the community's help, and the city's help, and the state's help. And so we need to get health access to children in early childhood. I think that is absolutely critical. It needs to be right away. We need to be starting at prenatal and working with our cross-sector health wellness aspects and getting health access to kids, like home visiting and nursing and that sort of thing. Then you have early childhood and making sure that students all have an opportunity, and I'm happy to see Mayor Walsh is making huge investments into early childhood so that every child has the opportunity. It's done through a mixed delivery system, which I think is also really good. We've done a mixed delivery system in Minnesota. And so that is also very critical. Then you have them ready for K, and you start with the in-school factors, but also that doesn't mitigate the fact that they need to be stable. So you have housing, and I know that there are some housing initiatives, and then there are the family support systems through our social services networks, and I know that there's some issues with foster care, and so you'd want to be able to address that. In my role as superintendent, I believe as school system, we see kids for the longest amount of time in terms of years and hours during the day, and somebody has to coordinate all of that. And so I believe it's our responsibility to coordinate all of that. I think historically we've coordinated the academic pieces, but we haven't really taken the responsibility to coordinate all of the other social services pieces, and I think it's our responsibility to do both the in-school and the out-of-school factors and coordinate all of that. And that would mean that I would need to allocate resources in-house to that coordination and work alongside. I know that this position sits on the mayor's cabinet. I have 8 years of governmental experience of leveraging and working across sectors with other agencies, and so I think that is a strength that I bring to this role. So we've worked with Department of Human Services on mental health grants. We've worked with them on our early learning services, on workforce for early learning. We've worked with the Department of Transportation on safe routes to school. We worked with our public safety on evacuation and crisis management. So, and we worked with Department of Health on home visiting and teenage pregnancy and vaping and other, important health aspects for student wellness and surveying students around wellness. So, there's the experience that I bring to this role around leveraging those political aspects and those agency aspects around all hands on deck.
Thank you.
Great. So we did receive some questions for the audience, which I think some of them we've sort of touched upon a little bit. One is about our BPS schools are disproportionately funded.
Yes.
How would you make sure that schools are equitably funded, and would you be willing to publicize school budgets? That's one question.
Thank you for the question, whoever asked it out there. I think that transparency in budgeting is one of the most important things that we can give to parents. We have a program in Minnesota called compensatory education. It's funding that we provide for students who receive free or reduced price lunch. We base that also on concentration of poverty in a school district. Recently, a few years ago, we had the legislature provide for that funding to go out to schools, but it didn't follow the student anymore. What happened was school districts were given 50% of the funding to use any way they wanted to, with no transparency. I was super upset about it because I felt like if a student is earning and generating those dollars should follow that student. It shouldn't be, that's the reason we put the money there. So it shouldn't be that school districts can just go ahead and just spend that money however they wanted to spend that money without any transparency or engagement with parents in the community. So what I asked for was at least have it posted on their website that if Lucy Laney School, for instance, was gonna have $50,000 of their funding go to some other project that the school board felt was reasonable, at least let the parents know that that money left their school district and then went for this other reasonable project, because I felt like those kids were then making a sacrifice for giving that up. So my core principle is that if you get $1, it should follow that kid to where they go. I think you have a good start on the opportunity index that you're doing here, and the student weighted formula and the way that it's done. I do think there are some basic services that all students need, such as nursing and social services and counselors and that sort of thing. And you have to really look at the balance of the resources that are getting out to schools. I know you also have kind of a soft landing for districts. We did that too in Minnesota. We called that a hold harmless, or we provided sparsity revenue to school districts that were small or remote. And I think that you need to have some of those unique funding streams that go out to schools so that they can have basic services for kids.
Great. Thank you. The next question comes from Monty Neal from Boston Educational Justice Alliance. And the question asks, BPS has largely eliminated interim or benchmark standardized tests other than what the state requires. Will you keep this policy?
Yes.
Okay, easy enough. Monty?
I don't really care for standardized testing. I'm an open book about that over the past 8 years. I'm not a big supporter of it. I think that it allows for accountability and it allows for larger scale decisions, but I don't think that tests ought to be used for individual high stakes students for children ever. I don't think that they were designed that way. They're designed for large scale, over time information that gives us a good gauge in terms of how to adjust our standards and how to adjust our practices as teachers. But if they don't give information for how a kid can learn better or a teacher can teach better, then I'd say don't do it.
And actually, that goes to this next question, so you can either add to your response or maybe sufficient what you just said. But the next question says, with BPS support, some schools, as part of the Mass Consortium for Innovation in Educational Assessment, MCIEA works with teachers and administrators to develop performance assessments and much richer accountability indicators. Will you support the district to expand performance assessments and and make accountability or more accountability metrics? I hope I read that correctly.
I think I understand the question. Let me just give my general sense of assessment. I think that assessment has always been part of good teaching and learning, period. Teachers assess their students and should be assessing their students, and so I would work with teachers on their pedagogical practices around use of assessment and aligning that to the standards. I believe in a standards-based education. I just don't believe in a test-based accountability one. We have had test-based accountability since No Child Left Behind, and it has not worked. So my personal preference is to help teachers teach better for kids, and that is actually having teachers work together on creating a common assessments, teach those, work in a professional learning community, understand where students are achieving when they're not achieving, finding out what it isn't, clear up confusion, and then teach again. you know, just the regular old Madeline Hunter good practice in teaching. So I'm not a big proponent of big standardized types of assessments. I'm a big proponent of teacher-made assessments and common assessments among teams of teachers who are working with students. And so that's my practice. It's not that I won't comply with testing. I mean, I was Commissioner of Education, so I had to comply with accountability systems and testing. I didn't have to like it. Like the Governor Mark Dayton would say, you know, sometimes we agree to things that we don't agree with. And so I know my place. I know that I have to comply with those things. I understand the public's need for the transparency and the results. I think that one thing standardized testing did do was give us a nice, big, bright, shiny light and say we're not getting good results for all kids. But I don't think that is delivered on the promise that that it's going to, you know, get better results for kids. So I think that that's where my philosophy comes from.
Right. So switching gears a little bit, I'm going to ask one question from the restorative justice questions that were submitted. There were 3 questions. I'll ask one, and then I'll go back to the panel. The question is, what is your understanding of restorative justice, and are you committed to helping to create a whole school approach to restorative justice that goes beyond responses to harm and builds genuine school learning communities that prevent harm in the first place? So let me repeat that. If
That's okay. I think I got it.
you got it, okay,
Yes.
perfect.
So I'm trained in William Glasser's choice theory, and it's about personal responsibility and about the choices we make and not coercing others toward your position. And so that's a philosophy that I really hold to, and I think restorative justice is one of those key programs and that really support kind of that theory. And we have one of the best trainers and national experts at the Minnesota Department of Education on restorative justice. Her name is Nancy Rieslenberg, Dr. Rieslenberg. She goes out and trains nationally, and she's shared with me, and I've been to her trainings on restorative justice, and we go into Minnesota schools and work with them on it. I'm absolutely committed to restorative justice because part of Glasser training and part of my own personal philosophy is every single conflict that you have is due to a broken relationship. And you have to heal those relationships. And without the healing of those relationships, you can't move forward. And so restorative justice allows students to make it right with everybody in the community and with the person that maybe you offended or didn't work with. So it's part of our core philosophy at the Department of Education, part of my own personal core philosophy and how you work with children. And so I would be absolutely committed to restorative justice practices as well as positive behavior intervention prevention practices within a school district and building strong school cultures where the adults create the conditions in which children succeed. That is my philosophy. I don't think children fail. I think adults fail children. And so children live up to our expectations that we set for them. And so I think we need to speak into children their worth and potential, and they will become what it is that we set up for them. Whether it's a family system, whether it's a school system, whether it's a community system, you just have to love the kids and then give them what they need to succeed.
Right. Thank you for that response. Kristen, I'll cede the floor back to you.
Thank you. So my next question sort of follows along that line. One of the things that we know in any school system, but particularly in Boston, is that you have a set of not only constrained resources, but constrained community conversation around it, right? So when you think about the 2 things that schools do, they do the educational piece and the whole child piece, and then they do operational pieces. Mm-hmm. School buildings, transportation, other kinds of implementation. And for a long time, our conversation in Boston, we've wanted to be all about social and emotional learning. We've wanted to be about whole child, but we get distracted by transportation and buildings. And so I'm wondering what your plan as superintendent would be for moving us from the operational, let's get kids on buses and to school and in buildings that meet their needs, to having done that and really having rich conversations about what our schools should be able to provide, the kinds of rich learning places that they should be. So how would you make that happen for us?
Such a good question. So when you are doing big change or you set a big, bold vision, it's so much easier to pay attention to the structural fixes and not the adaptive ones. I think that to focus on the adaptive change, you have to have very talented people who can handle the operational side. So it'd be building a strong team of operational folks who can handle that, so then the superintendent and the core individuals who are really leading the vision are able to lead the vision. But that doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to the structural pieces. So I've always been able to handle a number of complex things going on at the same time. And so I'm a good air traffic controller. And so I think that you hire talented people and then you check in with them regularly, but you don't get distracted from the deeper work that you have to do as a leader. This is true with principals as well. So principals can get busy with buses or schedules or budgets or evaluations that they have to do, and they forget that they're actually leaders and they need to feed the teachers. So I believe that leadership is about the adaptive pieces rather than all the operational stuff. So I can do both at the same time.
Great. Thank you. I'll go to Sean.
And I prefer actually the adaptive stuff than the management stuff, but I can do the management stuff.
Can I ask a
So I wouldn't avoid it, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, sure. I'll go back to Kristen. She has a follow-up.
Yes.
The only thing I want to push on is how, as a superintendent, would you lead the community of those who engage with BPS and support BPS in joining you in that adaptive challenge instead of the technical one?
I think that you just go out and have the conversations with folks and you build their trust. And then you show them that you create the vision with them, so they're part of it already. And then you go out and you just live your shared vision and your shared purpose, and you're constantly talking about it and constantly engaging and constantly connecting others to the vision. You meet somebody and you say, oh, have you thought about this? You would be a great partner with this piece of the work. And so I'm constantly trying to make connections and find partnerships and edify the plans. Always. It's just a constant renewal of the plan every day that I wake up and looking for opportunities.
Thank you.
That's the same with growing great teachers too. So if I see someone who's sitting there as a teacher, like I flew into my first interview, I was at the hotel and there was Sam, who was the bartender, sitting there, and I asked him, well, have you ever thought about being a teacher? Young African-American young man, and he said, no one's ever asked me. So you should think about it because you have the skills. Because he was so personable and just, it seemed like he'd be a great middle school teacher.
Sean.
Great. So you touched on, my next question, you touched on it a little bit. So I'm going to ask that and then add into another question that you were speaking to earlier. The first is the district prioritizes academic outcomes, but we recognize students to be whole people and need well-being, and need well-rounded growth. So my question is, what would your goal be around social emotional development for the district, individual, schools, and or youth, and how does community partners play a role in that? And then the second question was around the concentration of nonprofit organizations, and Boston are the highest amongst U.S. cities. What is your commitment to investing in evidence-based programs versus those without proven outcomes?
So I'll start with the last one, Mr. Brown, and that is, I think it's really important to have evidence-based programs. I also think it's important to try new things as well, with good guardrails around it. So, piloting new projects and trying new innovations. So I wouldn't want to stifle any new thought or new energy around a new idea just because it didn't have the evidence base, but I do strongly support when you're going to scale something that it is an evidence-based scale of the work. As for students and my goals around their engagement, I would like to see 100% of youth engaged. I think that that's really important. I'd like to see every youth have a mentor and an adult, caring adult in their life who they can depend on and trust and love. That's really important. I think youth athletic programs, cultural programs, arts programs, all of the things that help youth be connected and celebrate their uniqueness and their expression of their identity is really important. And so I'd like to see youth connected and after-school programming, co-curriculars, and of course that would really involve all of you and all of the partners, because we couldn't do that just ourselves. So I think that's important. And then I think it's really important, and we saw demonstrated in the valedictorian series, that when you look at high school redesign, that there's very deliberate work around launching students, that you start earlier with students, like with the case managed model in middle school, to launch and pre-launch students to get ready for their launch into college and career, so that they have the skills to navigate that, and they have a mentor even beyond the 12 years that we have them, or 13 years that we have them if we have preschool. So I think that there are some very deliberate things we can do within our counseling department, within our community networks, to make sure that all kids are connected and engaged.
Thank you.
Great. I love how my panelists try to sneak in two questions instead of one question. So they're learning. I'll end with Tony, and then we'll go back to some submitted questions from the audience.
I want to shift gears a little bit here. I'm wondering if you would share your experience and perspective on post-secondary pathways other than the traditional, say, 4-year liberal arts pathway.
Yeah. So it's a good question. I have a strong belief that all students need something beyond high school. That, the evidence is clear that if you have a 2-year degree, you make this amount. If you have a 4-year degree, you make this amount. If you have a graduate degree, you make this amount. So I think it's really important that we give students the option of post-secondary training and study. And so I'm a big supporter of kids going to 2-year or getting certificate program or some sort of pathway. I also like the idea of business stepping up and getting more involved in kind of the military model of recruitment, where they go back. Boeing and others, Microsoft, others have programs where they do apprenticeships, internships, job shadowing for kids. We have a great program for our students with disabilities called Project Success that goes in and does some life skills and work readiness training with kids and careers right in the business. So that's a great program. So I think that there's opportunities to have these career pathways for our students with disabilities, or students interested in apprenticeships, or getting a start early on their career and work study. I think every single student should have some sort of work study or work experience, job shadowing before they leave high school. I think that it's really important for them to explore careers early on and understand that there's more out there than being a doctor, a lawyer, or a nurse. There's a lot of really neat and good opportunities to give back within their communities and also to get the job training that they need.
Thank you. I'm going to move to some questions that have been submitted. One says, you mentioned earlier that setting a vision with big changes, is what is needed. What are the big changes that you believe BPS needs?
I think that it's a good question. I think that BPS has such a great opportunity to really be bold in their vision around their schools, and you have the Build PPS out there, so you have the opportunity to really look deeply at what does that mean for renovating schools, partnerships for new types of schools, or looking at your high school redesign and how does that work with career pathways, and how might you put in vocational opportunities for students. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. That will have to come from the community in terms of what the vision will be, and I'd be a good listener in that. I think that there's opportunity to really look at the science and technology in early grades. In engineering, so I think that provides an opportunity to really look at science and problem solving and thinking and experimenting in the scientific method. You get kids thinking and early literacy. So I think that those are really important aspects to a well-rounded education, as well as wellness and well-being, and what that means, both well-being in the community and being good citizens, as well as well-being personally. So I think that that's a really good, strong focus for any school system, really. In the 21st century, and just creative thinkers. So those would be some of the components to a good vision moving forward, but I think it has to come from the public, and that's what I would do within my first 100 days. Actually, it would probably take a much longer part of engagement. It took us like 18 months to put together our ESSA plan, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act plan, around public engagement, because we felt it was better to take our time on it and get it right, and then to try to rush fast and not have the right players at the table to be able to enact a plan and implement it well.
Great.
Did that answer your question around? I mean, I wouldn't come in with the bold assumptions about what to do. There are things that have worked to turn around schools fast for instance, in Memphis, and we got great test scores, and we didn't close gaps, but we narrowed them quite considerably. But I don't know that those are the right measures either when I'm talking about an all hands on deck sector approach. There are other outside measures as well that are just important, like criminal justice or housing or early childhood or health outcomes for the community or wealth equity gaps that exist. Are we making progress on all of those as well as getting better test scores?
Yep. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and we've talked about equity and inclusion a little bit. There are a couple more questions that have been submitted regarding that, so we'll come back to that. And Vanessa, do I owe you a second question? I just realized I owed you a second question. Apologies for that. I forgot about you. I did notice the look. So, but on a
We've been
serious
heavily
note,
over here on the right side. We'll get to you then.
on a serious, I know she just kicked me under the table. On a serious note, I think something that's been on people's minds around the political environment in Boston, and I think that I owe it to you to ask the questions. So there are two questions submitted regarding that. One says, Boston is a mayor-controlled city. We do not have an elected school committee. We have a chief of education position at the city level. How would you manage this type of structure?
So it's a good question, and I think, I've been Commissioner of Education for the past 8 years in Minnesota, and you just don't last that long if you can't handle the politics. And so I think that I'm a strong communicator and a strong collaborator, which allowed me to succeed, I think, for those 8 years in Minnesota. And it's because I'm very familiar with the role of a chief executive, and so I worked as the governor's chief advisor in education and was a member of his most senior team on education issues. And so I would look to build that relationship with the mayor and sitting on his cabinet and all of my cabinet colleagues, and also being able to speak to them about education. So like anytime the housing person would come, I'd say, oh yeah, we need some priority on children and family in housing, So, it's trying to always leverage the partners at the table with the cabinet. So it's governmental services is something I know, it's something I'm familiar with, and I'm familiar working in a political environment. So I know when to say something, when not to say something, who to say it to, when not to say it at all. And so I learned real quickly, you don't say anything unless you have a win in it for kids. So I think that is really part of navigating the political landscape and working with the chief executive. Also then working with the board and working with your chair really closely and the committees and having working committees of the committee so that everybody feels valued, their voices are heard, the community's voices are heard, and you're able to work through really difficult situations as well as work and promote a really bold vision forward. So it's something I'm really familiar with.
Yeah.
That structure is something I know.
Great. So you mentioned something about families and communities, so I'm going to ask a question that's related to that. So what are your specific strategies for building trust actively, including and incorporating the input of families as a way of improving family and community engagement?
The best way I have of building trust, and I may be naive, but it worked for me in Minnesota, and it's worked for me always, is everybody has my personal cell phone number. And that may be, everyone's probably bright-eyed, but I found that families never abused it, and community members never bothered me all the time, right? they called me when they needed something. And giving away that trust to them was, I think, critical in building the trust. They knew that I was open. They knew I got back to them within 24 hours, even if it was a short note to say, I'm in meetings all day, but I'm going to have so-and-so call you. And then it was the expectation of those on my team that we called within 24 hours to address the concern that that community member or that person had. That may seem like a small thing, but it's a huge piece of giving away your trust to folks, to know that they're open and that you're going to take their call and that you're going to meet with them and that their voice is valued. And then just showing up. You show up at their events, you show up at their meetings, you engage with them. You celebrate their wins, they celebrate, you grieve with them. I mean, all of that is part of just being part of a community. And that's how you build trust. And I'm a person of my word. So, if I say I'm going to do something, I do it. I don't overpromise. And I try to under-promise, over-deliver, right? So if I say something, I mean it, and I'm going to do it. And I think that builds trust and credibility.
Absolutely. I'll turn over back to Vanessa. Apologies, I forgot you earlier, but please.
Thank you. No problem. So I'm going to shift back a little bit to the equity set of questions, and
Okay.
maybe that opens up the space for the community's questions around that. I would like to hear from you if you could give us a sense of how do you define equity, and what does it mean to you? How do you operationalize that definition, your definition of equity? And also if you can give us some specific examples in which you have been successful in the past in implementing equity strategies or approaches to close achievement gaps.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I mean, I think equity is very different than equality, obviously, and equity is about providing the resources to students and communities and families based on what they actually need. It's being able to look at the power structures and the systemic barriers that are there. I'm sure you've seen the picture of the little student or child on a little stair step, and they talk about giving another stair step to the child who's maybe smaller to look over a fence. My philosophy is remove the fence and remove the barriers as best you can and create new opportunity for students. But I think even if you remove the fence, sometimes they still need an extra step. Because they have other life circumstances that have been in their way of being successful. So it's just doing whatever you can based on what that child needs, or what that family needs, or what that community needs in order to move the agenda forward for them. So that's how I define equity. How I've been able to do that? Well, just most recently, I've been part of leading the nation's chiefs. I've sat on the board of the Chief State School Officers since 2013, and we developed, as a group of chiefs, 10 equity commitments. And those 10 equity commitments drive a common language and common principles around what's needed in order to move equity within the state. And all of our state chiefs are now focused on equity. I can tell you when I came in 2011, there wasn't a lot of conversation around equity, but now we're very clear about it. And I feel very proud of that work that was done collaboratively. That was done under the current governor, Tony Evers' presidential campaign platform during the couple years ago. And so very proud of his work and leadership on that with the board. So that's a very tangible piece. In our own ESSA plan in Minnesota, we base everything on these 10 equity commitments. Even when I tweet out, I'll be like, equity commitment number 5, follow the money, because I think that being present and role modeling that is really critical, and that went out to all of our school districts so that they could also adopt it. So it's just core to who I am, and my core to my philosophy around educating children is that that's our strong focus. Also, inclusion is also another strong philosophy that I hold, as well as collaboration. So those are some core values that I see service to others.
Great. So to build on that topic, there are a couple of more questions around equity here. And just a time check, we have about half hour left, so we'll have plenty of time to come back perhaps to the
Sure.
panel. One question, Boston has been known for overlooking students and families from lower economic backgrounds. Can you tell us how you would ensure all students and families' voices are heard, regardless of ethnicity?
So I've talked a lot about engagement and going out to communities and going where they live and engaging with them. I think it's important to have, interpreters available in all languages so that there's no misunderstanding and that people understand what you're saying and I understand clearly what they're trying to convey to me as superintendent or as a community member. So that's how you engage folks. You just show up, you celebrate with them, you go to their faith-based communities, events and celebrations, and you just become part of the community.
So
Did I answer that?
yeah,
I
you
mean,
you did. But I think along that also, and related to the next question is about, what will you do to ensure that the staff, whether it's teachers, administrators, is really reflective of the diversity that's within the
Oh,
schools.
okay,
And
yeah.
and really this is the additional question that was submitted, so I'll read it verbatim. What is your position on ensuring the teaching staff represents student demographics? How will you achieve teacher diversity?
Well, I shared a little bit about my recruitment methods, just always talking about the profession. So I'd enlist other teachers into talking about how great it is to be a teacher, that it's one of the best professions ever. It's so rewarding. I loved being a teacher. I loved being a school leader. I love what I do every day, and I always am encouraging people to come into the field. But I'm also very deliberate about building teams that are that reflect more the diversity of the community that we serve. And so at the Minnesota Department of Education, we've been very deliberate in our hiring practices. We've been able to double the number of people of color at the agency. It's not anywhere near what we are able to celebrate, but it did double, and so that's been a very deliberate action of our human resources team. When I build my own team, I believe in having a diverse team that I'm able to appoint and work with. Matter of fact, my first team was mostly women and mostly women of color. Then it changed a little bit as we promoted from within the agency, because I also think there's an important piece of promoting within the agency and seeing talent. And so just being very careful and very deliberate about your team that you build and also your expectations for your school leaders and the teams that they build, and going out and just trying to find people who are interested in working with children and who love children.
So just to add to that question then, so how specifically, if you double the staff of color at the agency, what is
What do
the
we
one
do?
thing that, or two things that you feel worked, and whether it's attraction efforts and or promotion efforts?
So this was a governor's initiative too. So it wasn't just our agency, it was across the board, system-wide in the state of Minnesota that we were valuing diversity. The governor hired a diversity and inclusion officer. We went with Minnesota Management and Budget and hired recruiters who went out and supported us. So we were able to go out. We had diversity career fairs at the state level, so we would show up to those career fairs and we would interview folks, and commissioners would show up and go to those. My HR director was very intentional in terms of her targeted advertising and promoting of the positions. We made the application easier to navigate. We also were able to change some of our entry requirements so that we could then get folks in the door and then promote from within. So those are some of the strategies that we've been using. And then on interview questions, we also had folks engaged in the interview questions around that. And then we shared our values on the front end with our position descriptions so that they knew equity was a value. And we worked in the, across the agency with what we called change champions to have equity be a core value that was embedded within our organization. And we've done training around cultural competence with our own staff. So once we do get staff in, then staff will feel more comfortable staying around. So, I mean, you have to do the work of not only recruitment, but also retaining staff and making sure that they feel comfortable. This is both true at the state agency or whether you're in a school district or whether you're in a school building. You can't hire folks of color and then they don't feel welcome and engaged and part of the community. So that takes a lot of work.
Right, there's
Affinity groups and that kind of thing as well, you know, to make sure that everybody is feeling part of the community.
Absolutely, the inclusion part of the work.
Yeah.
I'm gonna do two questions that are related, I hope are related, and then I'll turn it back to the panel with about 25 minutes left, and then you'll have time for your closing statement.
Sure.
So the questions are around, what is your stance on middle school? So in Boston, our school committee never agreed to
It's a
school
snowball question.
reconfiguration. I'm sorry?
It's called a snowball. You just have that saying here in Boston, that it's a snowball question? It's an easy one?
I'm sure we have.
Because
a
I
lot
love
of
middle
those.
school.
Yeah. So, but in Boston, our school committee never agreed to a school reconfiguration with the elimination of middle schools. What is your stance on middle schools? And then on top of that one, there are some who believe that BPS has too many small single-track elementary schools. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, let me write these down so I don't.
So one is about small
Yep.
single-track elementary schools, and the other one is about your stance on middle schools.
So thank you for that question. You know, middle school and high school is my background. I've been thrust the past 8 years into early childhood and love that too, because there's nothing more fun than reading to preschoolers. But I do love working with middle and high school youth. It's just something that is true to my heart. So I believe in a middle school model and teaming, but I believe that you should team at all levels, whether it's elementary, middle school, or high school, because I think high-performing teams get better results for children. And so I support the reconfiguration that's happening. I would just suggest that within the framework of a 7 through 12 middle school, that there's teaming that happens for the adolescent child, and that there's specific training for child development for the adolescent child, and that teachers understand and are aware of those. I mean, you wouldn't want to treat middle school kids like elementary kids or they'll revolt. So I think that it's really important to really think about what are the models that you use, both with pedagogy and also in your structuring of your day, and the opportunities in course taking that you're giving to middle schools to challenge their minds and their creative thinking and their new autonomy that they think they have to be able to move the agenda for them forward. So that would be my thinking about that reconfiguration, that if you do it 7 through 12, that you're very deliberate about how you serve the children who are in middle school within that model. So that's that. And then in terms of too many small schools, I don't know that it's particular to elementary school or middle school or high school. You want to have school buildings that reflect your vision of equity. So if you have a strong vision of equity, what that means is that all children have access to those rigorous courses. They have access to school counseling and to social work and to nursing services. They have access to arts programming, athletic programming, connectedness, student clubs, debate, all of those things. It's much harder to have equity when you have a school that is a smaller school because you just can't afford it. So is the community willing to have some of those trade-offs so that they can have greater equity across the system would be a question that I would ask the community. If they're willing to say, we want to live out our promise of equity, of greater opportunity and greater connectedness for children within the community to have more rigor or to have more of these rich programs that are more well-rounded, then it may mean that you have to have trade-offs with the size of the school. So those are conversations to have with the community.
Right. I'll turn it back to the panel to see if there are any additional questions.
I actually have one if no one else does. Do you want to go first? Okay. You've talked a lot about team. And as a former teacher, I think one of the team members we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about is the school leader and the principal. And I'm wondering what your expectations for principals will be and how you will build a team understanding based on all the things you've talked about in terms of community engagement and showing up. And we have an autonomous network of schools. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about how you both think about that and how you would operationalize it across, I think we're at what, 127 schools now? That's in the right ballpark anyway.
So it's a great question because I believe everything that happens in a school leverages on a school leader. I think the tone is set at the top and that it's the leader who creates the conditions for the teachers to be successful. I've always said that if you have great teachers in a school and you have a principal who's less than effective, those great teachers can't go any higher than the effectiveness of that principal. Because the principal is the one who makes the resource decisions, they make the scheduling decisions, they make the staff, where the students are, what kind of programming goes, they're the cheerleader for the school, they get the partnerships, they develop the curriculum, they get all the opportunities, and they're coordinating all of this. They're like little mini superintendents in their school. And so they've got to really be able to embrace a shared vision, get teachers on board with that, and then enact that vision and implement it well. It's absolutely critical. I was fortunate in Memphis to be able to have 31 middle schools with incredibly dynamic, knowledgeable, some of them very inexperienced and some super experienced principals. And what I did was I clustered them. So we had 31 middle schools, and we clustered into 6 groups of more regionally where they were located. And I took one of the experienced principals, high performing, and had them lead that cluster of 6. And then we met as a group as 31. And then I also designed a concept council, which was I brought in assistant principal, people from the Department of Teaching and Learning, and then also the 6 cluster principals. And then I had a community member sit on that too, from Bridges, who was our youth leadership community member. And she sat on this concept council, and that's where we made all our decisions. We did book studies, not just with that concept council, but we also did book studies along with the principals. So they'd see me carrying my little book, and we would do shared learning, and we became a professional learning community, and we were just on fire. I have so much fun thinking about these principals because they're just such an incredibly inspiring group of individuals. And so I'm always chasing that. And so I would hope that if I was superintendent that we would we'd become a professional learning community, and the teachers would become a professional learning community, and we'd have a shared purpose, and we would work on our leadership skills together and really become our own personal mastery of our leadership, so that then that was out and was evident with everybody else. So I would lead that with the principals. And be very engaged with the principals. They'd all have my number. I wouldn't be once removed. I would be very involved with principal leadership because I think it's that important.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Sure, the bureaucracy question. Like any large organization, BPS depends on stakeholders and participants that can bring great strength and often are highly effective in accomplishing the mission, yet also have greater or lesser interest in maintaining the status quo. How do you engage the strengths of these groups to achieve progress and at the same time minimize any resistance?
Which groups again? I'm sorry.
Use your imagination. Across an organization as large as
Across
the
this
Boston
organization or across the whole community spectrum?
Just
within
I'd say let's look inside, though.
So like
of course,
silos and fiefdoms and that kind of thing?
Exactly.
So
right.
you work more horizontally, I would, and then finding ways to work cross-functionally on shared projects is a great way. We did that within the agency. We did that in Memphis. The Concept Council was one way to break down that, because you bring folks together from all those different groups, and you have your cabinet. So I would break down those silos by, one, being available, constantly talking and constantly finding for those cross connections opportunities within projects to work together. And so that's what I would do. I think that's the best way, is to get cross-functional work going based on a shared purpose and a shared identity of what the work is.
So, talking about the more mundane administrative things, let's suppose that BPS budget is $100, and you have full discretion and authority to spend that $100. How would you allocate the $100?
Well, that's a good question. So 80% goes to teacher salaries and staff mostly. I'd spend every dollar I can on the classroom, as close as you can get to the classroom. And that includes teachers, nurses, support staff, counselors, custodial staff, principal leadership. And then it comes back to the district office for central services. So my priority is out in the classroom and out in the school building, and then youth development projects and athletics, arts programming, after-school programming, unless that's taken care of by a partner, so that there's equitable. There'll be some schools that have partners and some that don't, so you may need to put it into another school. So that's where that money would go. I'm more about getting the money out to schools and to children rather than big bureaucracy and central office staff.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back to one of the audience questions, which is very specific, and I don't think we've covered quite yet, specifically, which is, what is your experience in providing success for ELL students, English language learner students? What program would you advocate for them?
So most recently, thank you for this question, as Minnesota Commissioner, I worked with the K-12 chair, Carlos Mariani, and staff members at the department to create the LEAPS Act, which was a focus on EL students. So we increased funding from 5 to 7 years in EL, because the research shows it takes 7 years to really get students to proficiency, especially academic proficiency. So if we wanted students to be able to take advanced placement or concurrent enrollment or to take courses in college, they needed also the support on their academic language for college level material. And so this was really critical, I think. We also were able to do multilingual seals of biliteracy. So we went from 0 to 1,600 now students getting a seal of biliteracy on their diploma, which is fantastic. I'm super, super proud of that. So working within school districts around assets and asset building of our we call them emerging multilingual learners now, and sharing their assets and working on that. Also, I believe a good strategy is that all teachers have strategies with working with EL students. This is the same for our special ed students and inclusionary practices. So many times that training goes only to our EL teachers or our special education teachers, but general education teachers need it so that you can have inclusionary practices happening. So a focus on making sure that you are giving good training skills to our general ed teachers around the pedagogy. For instance, joint productive work, language across the curriculum and focusing on language, contextualizing like ethnic studies courses or contextualizing for cultural competence, materials that are reflective of students' backgrounds. We had a great program with Mexico where we did some exchanges with books and textbooks with some of our children so they could see themselves reflected. We did work with our American Indian community around our treaties with our Humanities Center. And reflective American Indian education for all. And so there's a lot of really great work that you can do for students who are from diverse backgrounds or are EL students around language development. I'm not one that supports a pull-out model. I really am more about inclusionary practices. It's like if you go watch a movie and you leave for the movie and you come back, you have to ask somebody what was the movie. I think that there's pull-out that's needed sometimes, but as much as you can have the children interacting with other children and push the supports into a classroom is, I think, the best practice for children rather than having them leave their general instruction. So that's kind of my philosophy, and I like bilingual education. I think there's new technologies, assistive technologies you can use for students in terms of helping students understand language and in their first language and in English.
Great. So the next question, I'm going to honor this question, though I don't know that that's a general feeling, but I definitely want to acknowledge the question and read it verbatim. It says, at the present time, there is no trust, faith in BPS from parents, students, and teachers. How do you plan to build or rebuild trust, faith in BPS?
Well, thank you for the question, and I value it too. And if that's the perception of this individual, then that's their real perception. And so we have to regain that trust of them. I would like to see BPS be the first choice for all parents who live in the community. And I think that means that you have strong academic programs in every neighborhood. I think it means that you're out there talking about the positive things that are going on in the schools, both teachers and community members and those who work in our schools, and community folks who work in our schools are remarking about the schools positively. And then we invite them in to come and see the work and what teachers are doing with children. Oftentimes, the perceptions that folks have of our schools, they haven't actually been in our schools. And it would be really important that we open our doors and we allow people and partners to come in and see the good work that's happening in our schools, and that we highlight that and share the good work. And then where it's not happening, we're honest about that, and we go in and we work hard to make sure that those children are getting the excellent education that we're promising them. And sometimes that means real turnaround work in those schools. And sometimes that's hard and difficult and painful, but it has to happen.
Right. So I have two remaining questions that I haven't read, and I want to get to them. And so, first of all, thank you, because these are all really great questions from the audience. So thank you for that. We really appreciate it. And then I think we'll have enough time for perhaps one last question from the panel, and then we will proceed to your closing statement. So one question I think you kind of already addressed, which is around what innovative ideas you have around absenteeism and attendance issues, and how you make this a district-wide priority. So if you want to go ahead and either reiterate what you already talked about, or
Yeah.
if you
So
feel
this is a great opportunity. It's a good question. You know, this is a great opportunity for BPS to really work on absenteeism. I think currently, I was reading the state data reports, and it's 25% of students are chronic attenders, meaning 18 or more days absent. And then I think it was 46% are 10 or more days absent. So that is really, it's gonna take a full out effort to work with families and communities around why are children absent from school. Part of that is academic and just engaging, especially at the secondary level, and making sure that students are not disengaging and that they feel connected to the school and they have rigorous opportunities and that they feel welcomed and safe at the school, and getting them involved. So at the older level, you know, I believe it's easier to move the needle forward for older children. In terms of younger children, you have to do a whole family look back and try to understand what are the conditions of the family that's going on that the children are not being sent to school or coming to school. And I think that it's important to understand, you know, is that child being bullied? Is that child, is there mental health issues? Is there a crisis in the family in terms of stable housing? And so it's leveraging all of those pieces to ensure that you're looking at the root of why the child isn't coming or isn't there at school, and then working to eradicate that. Right. And get them there. So I think you do a full campaign as well as, you know, about the importance of that. But even a campaign, you know, you can say, oh yeah, bring your kids to school and attendance matters and all of these campaigns. It doesn't help if you're not helping the family. So it's really important to help the family. And then with older children, it's about getting them engaged and connected.
Great. In the interest of time, Liz, how much time we have? I have 10 minutes in my clock, but I just want to make sure. Okay, perfect. So The last question that was submitted from the audience reads, we hear a lot about college and career. What is your vision beyond work-oriented outcomes, and what structures and processes will support the vision in day-to-day school practice?
Thank you. And college and career is about really the level of rigor and getting kids prepared academically, but it's also about attendance and students understanding coming matters. And being there matters. So you want to get kids engaged. I think you also have services to help students navigate their success. I talked a little bit about this before. I think we should work on pre-launch kind of activities of students understanding, making goals, setting goals for themselves, having a plan, knowing about rigorous courses, knowing what's offered, and then following up on that and making sure you check in with them, getting them a mentor and a coach. They have an adult in their life who's going to help them with these skills. And then once they're launched, making sure that they have these skills because they've had job shadowing or they had apprenticeship experiences or internship experiences with a mentor out in the business community or out in the community in general, or doing service projects. So I think that that's kind of how I would approach it in terms of creating new opportunities for students with their own soft skills as well as their life skills and their academic skills to get them ready to be able to handle the rigors of really being autonomous, so that they don't fall through the cracks and feel as though they can't handle it when they leave our system.
Excellent. Turn it back over to the panel. Sean, I think you...
Yes, I do. And it's sticking on the theme of the criminal justice and those young people. There's a saying that young people don't care to know until they know you care.
Yeah.
So my question is, as a superintendent, how will you work with the Department of Youth Services to ensure that our young people who are in the juvenile justice system are not falling through the cracks educationally? And is there anything you see or believe can be done around making sure the curriculum support so those scholars are able to transition back into the district and have success?
Yeah, thank you for that. I worked as the high school superintendent at Minneapolis Public Schools, and we worked with the county attorneys. They had closed a school called Katahdin, and then we created what we called Success School, and we worked at a school called Stadium View, which was I oversaw that school that was for youth that were just placed in jail essentially at the time. And so we worked on the curriculum there and the rigor there, and then we worked on where are they credit deficient? How do we then give them credit for what they're credit deficient, and then how do we fill in the holes for them in terms of GED or other experiences and give them credit? We actually developed an adult diploma in Minnesota so that we could work with our correctional facilities to allow for students in our correctional facilities to get credit from where they were, because sometimes it was just looking, so many of our kids who found themselves in these situations were really close, like 1 to 2 credits away from getting their high school degree. And so we really worked to make sure that we had counselors in Minneapolis who were looking at those credits. And now within Minnesota, through our correctional facility, through our adult diploma, they're able to get their GED. Or I went to a graduation in Faribault Correctional Facility, and there were students there even getting their associate's degree. And so it's just really exciting to see that this adult diploma was paving the way for students to get a great start once they leave.
Great. And just finally, was that through community partners or through the district in terms of doing that work with?
Both. Yeah,
okay.
we had community partners who were part of that work, as well as the district and the correctional facility itself.
Great. Thank you.
In Minnesota, our correctional facility has a whole adult education program within the correctional facilities, and so we work with them collaboratively through our adult basic education.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So thank you, panelists. Sorry. Okay, got it. I'm getting the signal. So thank you for the help, Kristen. So thank you, panelists, for the questions, and thank you to the audience for the insightful questions. And at this time, Dr. Cassellius, I'll turn over to you for any closing statements.
Well, thank you so much. I shared with you a lot of the work that I've been able to do, but I know that this work can't happen with one superintendent or one team. It's going to take everybody. A lot of the work that I shared with you was work that a team did, that I worked cross-agency to do, or I worked with community partners to do, or we partnered with the correctional facility or with the county attorney to provide better services. So I don't come in here saying I can do everything. I want to be part of a team that is empowered and is ready to do just great work for children and for families and for communities. I think that it's doable, and I'd like to be part of it. So thank you so much for your time today, and to the community and for their very insightful questions. I look forward to learning more.
Great. Thank you for spending the time, for sharing a little bit more of your background with us, for making us understand your experience. So thank you. Good luck with the rest of the day.
Thank you.
As you know, it's going to be a long day. And for those of you, a reminder for those of you who tuned in, please send us feedback. The committee will love to hear the feedback. And superintendent search at bostonpublicschools.org is the email that you can send your observations to. So thank you very much to all.
Thank you.